Christianity can be a brand as much as it can be a faith. If you grew up Christian, you're probably already aware of the fact that there are Christian versions of just about everything, from streaming services like Pure Flix to entire genres of Christian self-help books, life coaches, radio stations, and Christian businesses. But is Christianity in the United States today really the way of Jesus? If we look back through history, we can see clear ways that the Christian religion has been used to cause harm. From early American slaveholders who used a few patched-together Bible verses to justify the humanitarian crimes they were committing, to a rash of scandals involving Christian leaders over the past few decades alone, it's easy to see why many might question whether this religion is even a good thing to exist in the world. The truth is, Christians have caused a whole lot of harm, and we often aren't willing to accept that reality. One famous story claims that nearly a century ago, the civil rights leader Mahatma Gandhi said, "I like your Christ, but I do not like your Christians, because your Christians are so unlike your Christ." When we read the stories of Jesus in the Bible, we see a person who exemplified a very different set of values than many might see in us today. A person filled with compassion and patience and love. And people were drawn to Jesus in a way that we just don't often see people being drawn to modern Christianity. In story after story, we see that Jesus drew people toward him like a magnet. So if that's the way of Jesus, a lifestyle and character that people couldn't help but want to be near, why does that feel so different now? Is it possible that God can't always be found in a Christian church? Is it possible that when many Christians envision God, the way of Jesus isn't the main thing that they think about? But imagine a Christianity where the adherents actually lived up to that character of Jesus. How would the face of this religion change if we actually took that kind of God seriously? What if Christians were the kind of people that our neighbors wanted to be around? I wanted to take these questions to one of the Christian pastors I admire most here in the Pacific Northwest, Pastor Andreas Bakai, who currently serves at the Walla Walla University Church in Walla Walla, Washington, and who spent many years building healthy community in Seattle, one of the most post-Christian areas of the United States. In this episode, we'll cover all that and more. This is Bridges Over Walls.
He described Christianity as eating fish. And people are like, "What are you talking about, Daniel?" And he's like, no, just listen to me. He's from London. He's like, "Just listen, bruv, listen." Yeah. "Okay, Daniel, what is it?" He goes, "Well, when you eat fish, like a Nigerian, you're going to eat the whole fish. So that means it's going to be fish bones. And fish bones are very small. Yep. And they can be delicate. But if one gets caught in your throat, that's going to be painful." He goes, "So there's lots of good meat. And you just have to be careful to take the meat and just not choke on the bones." And I think increasingly there are people who are choking on the bones and missing out on the good that Christianity brings to society.
You know, I've gone through this process of really taking apart the building blocks of my faith and looking at each one and saying, like, do I believe in this myself, or is this something that the people around me believed, so I'm just going to not think about it? As I'm putting those pieces back and rebuilding my faith, I saw this Jesus in the Bible that was so gentle and so humble. And that didn't look anything like the Christianity that I was raised with. Like, this Jesus is very, very interested in the powerless. He's very interested in the people who have very little ability because of their society, because of their resources, whatever it is. This trend caught me about Jesus that I couldn't let go of. And it created real problems with my faith and my relationship to my denomination. I'm seeing so many needs in my community, and I'm seeing people who can't pay their light bills. I'm seeing people with these practical needs that the church doesn't seem to care about. But I see secular groups doing the work of Christ. And so I saw the character of Christ lived out in people who didn't claim him with their words. And I didn't see the character of Christ in religious people. I didn't see the compassion. I didn't see the active curiosity where you want to know what people need so you can help. Seeing Jesus' character in people who don't claim him with words. Is the relationship between, people who don't claim Christianity or the secular-minded person, is it how it's presented in church, where they're kind of this moralless, hedonistic group of people, and we are the ones who understand Jesus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. It's interesting. My first full-time role was in Seattle as a pastor. And I remember one day being at the University of Washington. I was doing some campus ministry there, and I'd gone to visit with some other people who were wealthy, healthy, and educated, who gave money to more charities than fingers I had on my two hands, who recycled, composted, who were climbing mountains, who were going on humanitarian trips, and who were not Christian. Mm-hmm. And I remember pulling my boss, my supervisor, and saying, "You've got to help me. I mean, if they have all of this, why do they need Jesus?" And that was a question I sat with for 2 years. Yeah. Because I was seeing people who in many ways were living at least the behavioral life that I'd grown up being told this was a marker of good morality or holiness, without Jesus and without Christ. And it was, and that journey has continued. And I think I have some answers and convictions about the role of Christianity, but I really had to come to grips with the fact that we do not have a copyright on moral living and on being good citizens and making a significant change for good in our world.
And yet there's still this itch in my soul where it's like, okay, but I'm chasing the character that I see in Jesus, wherever that is. Yeah. And when it's not in Christianity, I will chase it there. Mm-hmm. There's this constant tension of when I meet people today and I come in with my faith, my Christian faith, and I claim that, but when I meet someone and their questions are all about how will this make me a better person? How will participating in your denomination make me a more loving or Christ-like person? And they may not always use Christ-like language, but they're talking about the values of Jesus, right? And often my thought is, well, with your history and with your understanding of the world right now, I think you're on more of a path toward Jesus' character by not joining the church. And that is something that I have never been able to figure out what to do with, because as much as I love my church and as much as I believe that Jesus is real and active in my life and is truly, the reason behind existence and all good in the world, if participating in church services is not going to lead them toward that and is not going to form them in that way, why would I ever want to bring them? But I don't know what to do with people who want good so badly and want to be good so badly that they cannot see themselves growing in that direction by participating in our religion.
I have seen congregations. I don't think I've ever been part of congregations, but I've seen and heard of congregations where I would be loath to tell people to go and worship at. And that grieves me to say, but it's true. I think that a group of people coming together and taking the label of followers of Christ does not automatically mean that they are saved people or that they are following Christ and being like Christ in their own example. And if that isn't the case, I think it would be a dereliction of duty to send people knowingly into really harmful places, even if the label of church is slapped across the building. I remember hearing a story in the 90s. This church was centrally located in Seattle, and they really wanted to reach out to the community. So they decided to do a series of meetings in which they sent flyers out to people and invited them to come. But this particular community is very centrally located and is actually the heartbeat of the LGBTQ community in Seattle. And so the person who was coming said, we also have a moral duty to make a statement about what our convictions are about this. And so they opened the meetings And when they opened the meetings, they had people who were coming and picketing, and the police were there because it got so heated. And those meetings didn't go 6 weeks. They went maybe a week and a half, and then they were tossed out. That particular congregation struggled to build any pathways into the community because it was a very combative stance, and they did not know how to be good partners, good neighbors, good friends. When I got there, recognizing that if we're supposed to be agents of good in our society, we ought to be pursuing the good rather than going around with a microscope trying to point out the bad, right? Because one of the things that I quickly recognized as well was at one point we're going to have a conversation about doing a food bank, and someone much wiser than me said, well, have you called the city or the council to find out what's going on there? And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, well, you don't need to do it again. Just figure out what other people are doing and join them.
Go pitch in.
What a great idea. We did that. I started to just think, how can we build connections rather than being an annoying pest? We want to actually add value and be people who, when you think of us, you think of us well.
Yeah.
And so at one point, if you came into the building, you'd have, like the AA class, Alcoholics Anonymous class there on a Tuesday. You'd have the Narcotics Anonymous class there on a Wednesday. And we were primed because there was a halfway house where a lot of prisoners were released, that we'd have people who would drop in. We just had to work with it because these were people who needed us, right? And so that experience for me was really formative in just recognizing that when you are coming straight out of hospital, when you're dealing with alcohol addiction or narcotics addiction, or when you are incredibly wealthy, you're not asking the questions that when I went to school, you were given as a rote way to take someone through a study to get to know Jesus. All of that had to be tossed out the window. And what did I do? I said, there's no book for this. I just have to talk to people. That was it. And I'll tell you, the people who decided to make a decision to join our community of faith, most of them who joined did so, and I can think of a couple of people in that congregation who basically loved them into our community. Just loved them. They would go and they would pick them up. They would be there for them. They would pray for them. They would be the ones picking up their phone if an abusive ex was calling. They stood up for them, and those people were loved into our community. So when you came into our community, you'd look around and you'd be like, this is a weird place. I can't figure it out. Because you have people who are like working for Meta and Google, and then you have these other people literally who've come from a halfway house and have a band and they have to report back. To me, that was always the goal, that we're a faithful presence wherever we are and we bless and bring light rather than going around trying to find people that we can condemn and people that we can call out, because that wasn't what Jesus did, like you said. He had his harshest words for the religious leaders. And I've grown in understanding that a worship service, and I know you meant more than this when you said, why would I send someone to a worship service? But I'm going to assume you meant only this, just for the sake of this point, cannot be the main mechanism for forming people into the image of Christ. We're trying to replicate the life of Jesus, and Jesus was with people for 3.5 years. They literally walked and talked and ate with him and slept on the same piece of dirt next to him and got up and washed their feet and carried on walking, and truncate that to an hour service, or maybe 3 hours cumulative if you add a Bible study and maybe a lunch in 1 week. That's not going to give you the same results. And I think this is the reasons why we find so often people who may be incredibly knowledgeable, who may know the Bible, but it has not soaked into their soul. And they haven't been changed. They haven't been transformed. When I think of the way in which he modeled his life, I see someone who was a non-anxious presence, the most non-anxious presence in the world, who had a magnetic personality, who listened carefully. I mean, Willard has a book talking about Christ called The Allure of Gentleness. Love that title. And it's been similar to some of the things you've spoken about. So I do think there is a There is something attractive about that. And I think part of our growth as well as Christians happens in community. Yeah. And when I read some of the New Testament books in Corinthians, they were a hot mess. I recognize that if it's not toxic, there is a softening, shaping influence of being with other people who think differently than you, who can challenge you to be more patient, who can challenge the views that you have. And we don't get that if we're not following Christ in a group.
It's interesting, I spent a long time thinking that Christians don't have the desire to really do much. Like they have the desire to go to a church.
Yes.
And they have the desire to read their Bible maybe. But I think what would draw you to another religion or worldview would be somebody who lives in a way that creates safety and healing in your life. And I think that's the thing we're missing.
Yep.
But if there's one wall that I want to build a bridge over, it's the wall between what we say and what we do.
Yep.
What we say and how and who we are.
Yep.
We don't say we're good for them. We don't say we're a positive influence on the community. We don't have to say anything. We live in a way that is undeniably so much that way that other people can say it about us. Yep. It's actually really hard work to learn how to love people and how to be doing good that they see as good, not good that I see as good.
Yep. Yep.
I think just because of the way that I had been taught that I need to stand firm in what I believe, but inherently that also means that I understand things better than someone.
Yes.
And I have to come from a position of like, I'm an expert and I have something to teach you. I think was what was really tripping me up. The first go-to for me was, okay, I need to find books by a Christian author on how to relate better to someone who doesn't believe like me. And that was actually a real problem. There were people saying, oh, this book sounds like it's what you're talking about, or this book. But I didn't know until I read it, like what was actually helpful and what wasn't. And you can read two books on the same thing, and one can actually lead you in a harmful direction, and one can lead you in a beneficial direction. Or maybe all of the options that you have lead you in a harmful direction because of your brain. So last night, I decided to test this again. Opened up a book about the secularization of young people.
Yes.
Right? Open up the book, start reading through a couple chapters, and I'm like, okay, I have learned that I inherently distrust Christian material because the way that I understood the books that I read early on led me down harmful paths.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it was marriage books, whether it was relational books, there were a lot of problems that came from me trusting what they said.
Yes.
And I didn't have the background, the experience to really know how to discern, what good I could take, what bad. I was just like, I trust this person because obviously they have theological degrees and all of this stuff, and that mattered a lot to me at the time. So last night I'm reading through this book and like, I could read no more. Like I got to a part where it described young people as just kind of like when you have no moral compass, this is what happens. Oh. And, in a completely relativistic world, and we can't blame them for growing up in this environment. And it put all of the moral burden and all of the wrong on young people or on secularizing Christians.
Yes.
Instead of accepting some responsibility. And truly, that's just not what I see in the world. I don't see secular people as having no moral compass. I don't see young people as having no moral compass. But when you have a set of guidelines that's about what you eat and drink, when and where you go to church, how many Bible verses that you've read, but not about how you treat people, how you handle your money, right? All of these different things that really are closer to what I see in Jesus' life and teachings.
Yes.
You do see that morality in secular people often much better than you see in Christians.
Sure. And one of the things you have me thinking about so much now, this idea which I've thought about, haven't fleshed out, that sometimes we have to, rather than think into new ways of being, we have to be into new ways of thinking. So if we're just a head on a stick and we just need to have the right knowledge, then I think we become soulless people who are not warm, who are not making a difference, who do not care about the here and now. The idea that some people had that it was such a shame Jesus only had 3.5 years on earth, and if he'd been here for longer, he could have done so much more, is, I think, a misunderstanding of the nature of what Jesus was here to do, and also the nature of what he has called us to do. But that's a side comment. What I wanted to say is, I've heard too many stories, and I didn't grow up in the States, right? I grew up in England, moved here in my mid-20s to go to graduate school. But I've heard stories of denominations who, during the civil rights era, forbade their members to be part of that.
Yep.
They said, don't be political.
Yep.
Just stop. I mean, now we look back on it, and I would think, other than some pretty retrograde people, almost everyone can say the civil rights movement was a moral and just movement, and one that needed to have happened. But during that time, there were many who were given directives: do not be part of this, don't talk about it, don't associate with them, don't march with them, have nothing to do with what they're doing. MLK is a radical who needs to be eschewed. And it's crazy, because you're reading the words of Jesus, you are hearing someone making a forceful, cogent application of Jesus' words and saying, no, don't be part of it. I think that is a place where we have missed the mark. And it's much more difficult in real time to know if another movement is one which you ought to be throwing your moral weight behind, or you ought to be part of, or whether you should be careful of it. I get that. But I think, unfortunately, there tends to be a lot of reticence when there is any move towards a lot of the people, like you said, who Jesus was most concerned about, or the people who find the jackboot of, oppression on them. We tend to be quite reticent to wade into those conversations.
Yeah.
I think living a moral life will have political implications and will challenge people in positions of power, because inherently the Bible is a book for losers. Losers in the sense that it's not those who win, right? It's the pharaohs and it's the Caesars who are the problems, and the people who are part of the people of God and the community of faith are the ones who are usually under oppression, and who are having to then read the story and interpret the story as people who don't have power. But it's odd now, because we live in a place where we have power, and I don't think we know quite what to do with that.
Like, what we care about is very blatant and niche, I think. And you'll even hear it in church as a Christian. There's a lot of talk about baptisms. There's a lot of talk about bringing people there. There's a lot of talk about all the people who are not us yet.
Yes.
And when you see us as all of the human race, all of God's children, there starts to be a real breakdown, even with those of us who are leaning toward other-centeredness, leaning toward, shoulder to shoulder, sleeves up, involved in our community kind of Christianity.
Yes.
And so I think the wall that I see in my current place of life is just like, we aren't showing up in meaningful, positive ways until we want something. In most people's lives, we're there because we want somebody to come to our church, because we have a numbers thing that we need, or because it's not because we want to make their lives more positive in like a real practical felt way. It's not because we want to support their new business, unless it's directly tied to Christianity. So then they're one of ours, And I think the most helpful thing I've learned is like, embody the God that you want people to see. And I don't mean as a savior. I don't mean as the person who can forgive sins. I mean the character. So for me, that means when I'm around someone, do they feel safer? Do they feel more at peace? Do they feel like I'm interested in them? In what way am I making a positive impact? Not by correcting them, not by pushing them, but, am I a presence that heals? Am I a presence that empowers and encourages?
Yes.
And I think it's easy to look at yourself as if you're doing that when you're not. But you can quickly see the effects. Like, people want to be around you more, right? They trust you with more information about their life and more of their story. And they, just naturally come into wanting your presence to be there. And I've found that especially with people that don't share my faith, because in some ways, and I'm an alternative Christian presence in their life. And very often this is not what Christians represent in their life. And I saw this, so during college, I won't go too far into this, but I put myself through college mostly off of Craigslist jobs. And I found myself working for this woman who had been through a pretty traumatic divorce, had this big old house that was all hers and didn't have enough help to keep up with it. I basically came in for a one-day job, did it better than she expected, and she invited me back day after day after day until it became my job for like a year and a half to just help her maintain this property. We were working together, and she's packing up her things. And it's really hard because she's been through a divorce, right? And there's so much tied to her family and her marriage in these things, and she just kind of wants it behind her. And I'm there with her, and she's crying sometimes, and I'm talking her through it I'm dirty. I'm like dusting stuff off, packing it up, moving furniture. I'm sweaty. And this older couple comes to the door. You see them coming down the driveway, right? They park their car. They come up to the front porch. They knock on the door, and she gets up and she says, "Yes, how can I help you?" And they're basically not from my faith tradition specifically, but they're literature evangelists. Oh. And they're there to give her the truth. And so there's this interaction, and it's pretty negative. She's like, "Please don't ever come back. Like, I don't want anything to do with you. Christians have not been kind to my family. They've not been good to me." And when she came back from that, I'll never forget this conversation. She said, "What I see in you and what I see in the people that just came to the door are very different types of religion. You represent something entirely different." And she never converted. Like, this isn't a story of how I led somebody to my church. This is a story of how somebody got to see two very different views of Christianity in the same day. And I'll never forget that, because I thought about, like, who do I want to be in this story? And it was one of those rare cases where I wanted to be me. It was one of those rare cases where I felt I had done right. Because as she's going through her divorce, as she's deep in pain, I'm just trying to put myself in her shoes. And the people that come and say, "Hey, where you're at is not good enough. And you need what we have." And there was no interest in hearing about her life. There was no interest in helping her with this overwhelming amount of stuff that she was dealing with, and I was getting paid to be there also, sure. But in everything I did, I wasn't doing the minimum. I was there truly as a person to make a healing impact in her story.
That's good.
And I take that with me. I was outside of the church at the time, and I was still talking about my faith.
Oh, you were?
I never let go of God. I let go of organized religion for several years because I thought it got in the way of God. My relationship with God, it was a tax on my relationship with God. It was an obstacle. And really, if anything, that experience continued those questions for me. Like, what are we doing? And how are we, what kind of presence are we in somebody's life? So that's the obstacle and the bridge that I have identified for myself. And what I hope is something true and helpful for everyone in my faith is the bridge is just genuine interest and genuine love for people, no strings attached first. You can hope that they someday see things your way.
Yes.
That's fine. But if that's the place you operate from,
yes,
it's a completely different kind of interaction than if you love people because they are worth it, because they're valuable just by who they are. And you will be a completely different presence in somebody's life if that's your posture.
Yeah, I agree. I think another thing I would add, Caleb, is, and I've mentioned this before, is living with a sense of curiosity.
Yeah.
I think that's really important to bring walls down. If we're not curious about other people, if we live as if we have all of the answers, we're not going to ask questions. We're just going to come to tell people where they're wrong. And no one wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I just want to be told how wrong my entire existence is, right? And like my ideas about ultimate things have no basis in reality, and I'm actually an amoral person. Nobody wants to hear that. So I think we have to live with genuine curiosity to be able to see where God is at work in people's lives, and to be able to affirm it in language and in ways that is helpful for them. And if we could all be more curious, I think it'd make a huge difference in our lives. We'd hear things that we would have missed, right? We may get to people who we're adamant need prayer, and in being curious and listening, we'll hear, oh no, they actually need a meal. Yeah. Oh, they actually need a break. But that only comes if we're curious, if we come with rote answers, and if we come ready to tell rather than to listen and to learn. I think walls will not come down.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially when you live in a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-political type of society. We have to be willing to take what people give to us and not shame them for their offerings, right? For being who they are, not shame them for what they bring to the table, but find ways to be able to show gratitude for it. But when I think about walls, is the reputation that Christians have in America. People think of us and immediately think of those who are hostile towards people who do not care about the environment, right? Who are not trying to be gracious in the way that they allow people to express themselves, who don't care about issues of justice. Christianity cannot be co-opted by any political party or political ideology. It cannot. Christianity has to stand apart from it and has to have a critique on all of it. There are many people around the world who have accepted Christ, not realizing they've accepted Christ, and they've accepted it with a certain cultural packaging, and they have made the two synonymous.
Yeah.
And that is where we get into real trouble.
You know, is there something magnetic about your faith? Is there something that draws people to say, wait, okay, so I have my problems with these people I've met, but this person sees it this way, and that's actually super cool. Yes. Because what I've found is when people read the stories of Jesus, very few people have a problem with Jesus.
Yes.
They have a problem with what we do with the Christian faith and what we do as Christians. But there is something almost universally magnetic about Jesus' gentleness, his compassion, his ability to walk the world with such care for other people around him. And I think that when you do that, you offer an alternative view to where people can say, like, actually, this is somebody I want around. This is somebody I would be able to trust and would be able to share some life with. And maybe they never convert to my faith, you know, but there is an impact made in the direction of Christ-likeness, in the direction of good. And the implications of that are things I will never see.
And I think one of the challenges that I've had and try to continue to think through is even the way our language signals the ways in which we think about people. So, for example, talking about saving the lost.
Right. Yep.
I mean, that's like those books you've read. We're making some huge implications right here about people and about who we are once we start to use that type of language. And so I'm careful even of that in trying to basically recognize that we're all seeking after a life that is good. We're all seeking better opportunities for our families. We're seeking to be healthier people. We're seeking to be better neighbors. And we can focus on the things which we have in common and try to live well together rather than, especially in a very secular part of the world, being always ready for a fight, which often just bruises and wounds and doesn't bring any healing, you know? And you'd mentioned what would it look like if you were trying to do, if you're trying to have conversations with people who did not accept your sacred text. Well, you made me think of growing up in England and having to learn very, very quickly how to just if I was going to do any sort of sharing of my faith, it had to be without a text. And they were usually much better at it because they had some real significant things when they had Ramadan, and we all knew, oh, it's Ramadan. Oh, they're doing this and they're going to have this amazing meal at the end of the night. Or he would invite me to his home and give me these sweets that they had. And I remember having in my mind, well, these people open their home and they feed you really good food.
Yeah.
And that's about it. There's no hook. Oh, this is interesting. Like they just feed you good food and they're kind to you. And then that's it.
It seems like such common sense. We gravitate toward people who are good to us. End of story. And there's so much anxiety and panic around people leaving the church. But if we thought that way, it's like, well, where are they going? They're going toward people who are better to them. And if the church is the people, the collection of people who are the best to them, people will not leave that. Or very rarely will leave that. You gravitate towards safety and peace and health. How do you think that we could be people like that? How do you think that we could not just make material, but really live it in a way that someone else out there in the world can say, like, I can't help but be drawn to a person like that?
I think we have to live in the world with a posture in which we understand that God is already at work in the world. And everything we do is joining him as a partner. That is a very different posture than saying the entire world is dark, there is no good. I therefore need to come in with a flaming sword to cut people down and to right every wrong and ill. I think it helps you to take a step back and to be able to walk into spaces and say, you know what? God is already at work here. He's already been at work, regardless of me, regardless of what I say, he's already at work. Just see yourself as a link in a chain.
Yeah.
That's it. And I think the problem becomes when we see ourselves as having to be the entire chain. So I'm going to meet someone and I need to get them from where they are to where I think they need to be, which is sitting next to me like 4 times a month in a church. And it's like, no, just be the next step and be kind to them. And if you do that, I think all will be well and all manner of things will be well, like Julian of Norwich says. Just have that sense of trust, like God is there. God is at work. And that has helped me so much, because there were times earlier in my life where I'd feel a sense of guilt, almost like an Amway, salesperson. I haven't hit my quota, like I need more people. And I was like, this is ridiculous. This doesn't work this way. I don't have quotas. No one's selling anything. I'm not the one who changes people's lives. I believe that there is a spirit that's transcendent above me. And now that I believe the Spirit is already at work, I can walk with confidence and freedom and no anxiety into spaces and go, I have an opportunity to be just part of a chain in their link. It could be just a conversation. It could be just giving some food. It can be just giving them a hug if they've had a terrible day. And that's enough. Move into spaces with love, with no anxiety. And then maybe they may be open. And if not, you still believe the Spirit of God was working, right? And I go back to Romans, those early chapters, and say, well, there will be people who did not have the opportunity or did not ever make that step. And I leave that to God and his generosity to calculate and to figure out. I don't need to be concerned about that.